When was the last time you rested? The question drifted across the yard so quietly that the hammer in Clara Bennett's hand stopped before she realized it had. She had been driving loose nails back into the fence since first light, her sleeves rolled high, a faded sewing basket resting beside the porch where she had left it before sunrise. She looked toward the rancher only long enough to know he was waiting for an answer he did not expect her to give. Ethan Carter stood near the well with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a dented coffee cup warming his hands. He did not step closer. He did not repeat the question. He simply waited the way a man waited for rain, instead of trying to command it. Clara lowered her eyes to the fence rail and struck one more nail that did not need striking. "I cannot remember," she said at last. The words sounded unfamiliar, as though they belonged to another woman. Ethan nodded once. Nothing more. He crossed the yard, set the coffee cup on the porch rail beside her sewing basket, and returned to lifting feed sacks into the barn without another word. The steam rose between them. She did not touch the cup while anyone could see. A wagon rattled past the lane. Mrs. Harper glanced toward the ranch, slowed just enough to satisfy her curiosity, then continued toward town. Clara kept working until the sound faded. Only then did she wrap both hands around the warm cup. The first sip stayed in her mouth longer than it needed to. A small boy appeared beside the chicken coop, carrying a bucket almost too large for him. Benjamin, Ethan's nephew, watched her over the rim of the bucket with the open honesty children had not yet learned to hide. "You are shaking," he said softly. Clara smiled without showing her teeth. "Just cold." Benjamin frowned. "It is warm today." Before she could answer, Ethan called the boy to help gather kindling. Benjamin obeyed, but he looked back twice before disappearing behind the barn. Clara set the empty cup beside the sewing basket and noticed a neatly folded blanket waiting on the porch bench. No one mentioned it. No one told her to use it. Yet when the evening wind slipped across the pasture, she found herself pulling it over her shoulders, wondering who had remembered she had never once asked for warmth. The blanket remained on Clara's shoulders until the last feed sack was stacked and the light had thinned above the western pasture. She folded it carefully before supper, matching each edge, then placed it on the porch bench exactly where she had found it. The next morning it was there again, dry and warm from the kitchen stove. Ethan said nothing about it. Clara said nothing either. She began work before sunrise, sweeping the porch, carrying water to the hens, and sorting the mending Mrs. Harper had left in a flour sack. There were 3 shirts, a boy's coat, and a pair of work gloves split along the palms. Clara set her sewing basket near the window and worked until the stitches disappeared into the worn cloth. Benjamin sat across from her, shaping a whistle from a willow branch with a dull pocket knife Ethan had given him for chores. He watched her mend one glove twice. "Uncle Ethan can buy new ones," he said. "These still have work in them," Clara answered. By noon, the gloves were hanging beside the barn door. Ethan found them when he came in from checking the north fence. He turned one over in his hands, studied the reinforced seams, and wore them back outside. That evening he left a small spool of dark thread beside her sewing basket. No explanation. The following days settled into a pattern. Clara rose first, but coffee was already warming when she entered the kitchen. She repaired tack while Ethan worked the horses. She kept Benjamin's sums at the table each afternoon and made him finish them before he ran to the creek. In return, Benjamin carried her water without being asked and saved the least bruised apple for her supper plate. Ethan fixed the warped latch on her room before the wind could wake her again. He added no lock. He only made the door close true. Clara noticed. She noticed everything. On Sunday, she sat down after dinner intending to rest for 1 minute. When she opened her eyes, the room had gone gold with late afternoon. Her sewing basket had been moved away from her feet so she would not knock it over. A fresh cup of coffee waited. On the table, covered with a saucer to hold the warmth. Ethan was outside splitting wood. Benjamin was reading quietly near the stove. Neither of them looked surprised to find her still there. Clara reached for the coffee before it cooled and found Benjamin watching from behind his book. He lowered his eyes at once, but not before she saw the small satisfaction on his face. She drank half the cup sitting down. That was new. By Monday, the north wind had loosened 2 shingles above the pantry and driven dust beneath the kitchen door. Ethan climbed to the roof while Clara mixed flour and lard at the table. Benjamin held the ladder, though Ethan's weight kept it steady enough without him. No one hurried. When the biscuits came from the oven, Clara wrapped 2 in a clean cloth and carried them outside. Ethan accepted the bundle with a quiet nod, then ate on the porch step rather than returning to work. Benjamin sat beside him. After a moment, Clara sat on the other end. The space between them remained wide enough to feel proper, but she did not rise until Ethan did. That afternoon, a rider brought word that Mrs. Harper's youngest girl had taken fever and the household washing had fallen behind. Clara packed broth, clean cloths, and her sewing basket. Ethan hitched the bay mare without being asked. "Road will be muddy near the creek," he said. He placed a folded quilt behind the wagon seat and checked the wheel pins twice. At the Harper place, Clara worked until the child's breathing eased and the kitchen no longer carried the sour smell of neglected dishes. Ethan repaired a broken pump handle in the yard. Benjamin split kindling badly but steadily. They returned after dark beneath a thin moon. Clara had said little all day, yet her shoulders no longer held themselves near her ears. At the cabin, Ethan lifted the sewing basket from the wagon and placed it beside her chair. Benjamin carried in the empty broth pot. Clara reached for the quilt, but Ethan left it around her shoulders until they were inside. "You did enough today," he said. It was not praise. It was permission. Clara stood beside the stove with one hand resting on the quilt's worn edge. Then she sat, while Ethan warmed the coffee and Benjamin set 3 cups on the table instead of 2. No one remarked on the extra place. Clara looked at it for a long moment before drawing the chair toward her. Clara pulled the third chair close enough that its legs touched the table. Benjamin poured too much coffee into her cup and wiped the spill with his sleeve before Ethan could hand him a cloth. Clara folded the cloth once and cleaned the rest herself. No one spoke of the chair. After that evening, it remained in place. The days turned colder. Frost silvered the water trough before dawn, and Ethan began leaving a split log beside the stove so Clara would not have to carry one from the woodpile when she rose. She still woke first, but she stopped stepping outside before breakfast. Instead, she measured oats while Benjamin fed the fire, and Ethan checked the stock from the kitchen window with his coffee in hand. Work came before comfort. It simply no longer came before everything. Clara found the ranch accounts in a drawer beneath a stack of seed catalogs. The figures were orderly until midsummer, then hurried and uneven. Ethan had been losing money on feed because the south pasture fence leaned far enough for cattle to push through. Clara walked the line after dinner, counted the broken posts, and returned with mud on her hem. The next morning, she placed a list beside his cup. 6 posts could be reset. For needed replacing. The wire was sound. Ethan read it twice. "You know fencing? My father kept sheep." That was all she offered. He did not ask for more. For 3 mornings, they worked the south line together. Ethan dug and set the posts. Clara held them true while Benjamin tamped the soil with more determination than strength. At noon, they ate bread and cold chicken beneath a cottonwood. Ethan passed Clara the larger piece without looking at her. She cut it in half and gave part to Benjamin. By the 3rd day, the fence stood straight. Ethan opened the gate, tested the latch, then handed Clara the ranch ledger. "You saw what I missed." She wiped the dust from her fingers before taking it. That evening, she balanced the feed costs while Benjamin practiced spelling. Beside her, Ethan repaired the handle on her sewing basket where the wood had begun to split. He worked slowly, shaving the new peg until it fit without forcing the old frame apart. Clara watched his hands once, then returned to the figures. When he finished, he set the basket near her chair. The handle stood firm. So did the south fence. So did the 3rd place at the table. For the first time, Clara left her shawl hanging beside Ethan's coat overnight instead of carrying it into her room. The shawl was still beside Ethan's coat when Clara came into the kitchen before sunrise. She looked at it once, then fed the stove and set 3 cups on the table. By the time Ethan returned from the barn, the ledger lay open beside his breakfast. Clara had marked the feed purchases that could wait until spring and the repairs that could not. The west shed roof needed patching before the next snow. 2 harness straps could be mended instead of replaced. Benjamin needed new boots, but the leather from an old saddle skirt would serve if cut carefully. Ethan read the figures while eating. That saves near $12. Clara spread jam across Benjamin's bread. It saves $14 if you stop buying lamp oil from Mercer. Ethan glanced up. Why? His measure runs short. Benjamin nodded with solemn importance. I saw him fill the can below the line. Ethan closed the ledger. He did not praise either of them. That afternoon, he rode to the mill and returned with flour, lamp oil from another merchant, and a narrow strip of good leather placed beside Clara's sewing basket. Over the next week, the house changed by inches. Clara lined the pantry shelves with clean paper. Benjamin labeled the grain bins in his best hand. Ethan built a low stool for her feet after noticing she tucked them beneath her chair on cold evenings. She mended his winter coat at the elbows and added an inside pocket for the ranch receipts he was always misplacing. He found it, tested the stitching with one thumb, and wore the coat every day after. Nothing was declared. Everything was used. When the first heavy snow covered the south pasture, the three of them worked before breakfast to clear a path between the cabin, barn, and well. Ethan broke the crust with a shovel. Clara followed with a broom where the drifts were thin. Benjamin carried kindling in short, determined trips until his cheeks turned red. Back inside, Clara set bread near the stove to warm. Ethan poured the coffee. Benjamin divided the heel into 3 pieces, though his was plainly the smallest. Clara traded with him without comment. That evening, the wind pressed hard against the windows. Ethan checked every latch, then placed an extra log beside Clara's room. She noticed the roof over the pantry had held. The repaired sewing basket sat near her chair. Her shawl remained by the door. On the table, the ledger showed enough saved to buy Benjamin proper boots before Christmas. Clara opened her basket and took out the leather Ethan had brought. She measured Benjamin's feet while he tried not to squirm, then began cutting soles. Ethan sat across from her repairing a bridle. Their hands moved under the same lamplight, each attending to work that would keep the other 2 warm, fed, or safe. Near bedtime, Benjamin left a folded scrap of paper inside Clara's basket. She found it after he had gone upstairs. 3 words were written in uneven pencil, "Our winter things." Clara read them twice. Then she placed the note beneath her spools, where the handle Ethan repaired would keep it from being lost. By the week before Christmas, Benjamin's boots were finished. Clara had shaped the soles from the old saddle leather, stitched the uppers twice, and lined the inside with wool cut from a coat too worn to mend again. She set them beside his chair before breakfast. Benjamin stopped in the doorway. He did not touch them at first. He looked at Ethan, then at Clara, as though the boots might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Try them," Clara said. He pulled them on and walked the length of the kitchen with great care. The left heel clicked against the floor. The right did not. Benjamin walked back again, smiling now. Ethan lowered his coffee cup to hide the movement at the corner of his mouth. The boots fit through the toes with enough room for spring. Clara had measured well. That afternoon, Benjamin carried wood, until Ethan told him the pile was high enough. He carried 2 more pieces anyway and placed them beside Clara's stove log. She found them there after supper. On Christmas morning, snow lay smooth across the yard, untouched except for rabbit tracks near the garden fence. Ethan gave Benjamin a new arithmetic book and a proper whetstone for his pocket knife. Benjamin gave Ethan a cloth pouch he had sewn badly and proudly. Then he placed a small parcel in Clara's lap. Inside was a wooden thimble, sanded unevenly but smooth where her finger would rest. "Uncle Ethan cut the shape," he admitted. "I finished it." Clara turned it once beneath the lamplight. Her old brass thimble had split along one side weeks before. She had wrapped it with thread and kept using it. Neither man had mentioned noticing. She placed the wooden one inside her sewing basket, beside Benjamin's note, then used it to finish the cuff of Ethan's shirt that afternoon. The days after Christmas settled back into work. Clara read the ranch ledger each Monday. Ethan left the receipts in the pocket she had sewn. Benjamin studied at the table and learned to divide figures without counting on his fingers. When Clara's cough lingered one cold morning, Ethan warmed a brick near the stove, wrapped it in flannel, and placed it beneath her feet before he went to the barn. He did not ask whether she needed it. By then, he knew she would say no. Clara rested until the brick cooled, then rose and baked bread. She saved the first loaf for the house instead of sending it with Ethan to town. At supper, Benjamin told a poor joke about a mule and a preacher. Clara laughed before she could stop herself. The sound startled all 3 of them. Ethan looked up from cutting his bread. Benjamin stared, delighted. Clara pressed her lips together, but the laugh came again, quieter this time. No one made much of it. Ethan passed her the jam. Benjamin repeated the joke badly. Later, when Clara reached for her shawl, she found Ethan's coat hanging over it, the two sleeves resting together against the cabin wall. The thaw came early, softening the yard into mud and sending water beneath the west shed where the winter feed was stored. Clara saw the dark lines spreading along the floor before breakfast. By noon, 3 stacks of hay had been moved to higher boards, but the roof had begun leaking in 2 places, and the bottom sill had gone soft enough to press beneath Ethan's thumb. He stood in the doorway with rain dripping from his hat and counted what remained. New boards, shingles, 2 days of hired help before the next storm. The ranch ledger did not hold enough for all 3. Ethan closed it and looked toward the pasture where the bay mare grazed near the fence. Clara followed his eyes. He had raised that mare from a foal. Benjamin had learned to ride on her back. No one mentioned selling her. Ethan went to town the next morning to ask prices anyway. While he was gone, Clara emptied her sewing basket onto the kitchen table. Thread, needles, Benjamin's note, the wooden thimble. Beneath the lining lay a narrow envelope she had carried from place to place for 6 years. Inside was enough money for a stage ticket east and several meals along the way. It was not much, but it had always meant she could leave before anyone asked her to. Clara counted it once. Then she folded Benjamin's note around the coins and placed them in the ranch ledger. She spent the afternoon measuring the shed, marking the soundboards with chalk, and cutting a canvas grain cover into strips that would keep the hay dry until repairs were finished. Benjamin worked beside her, holding the cloth straight and asking no questions until he saw the empty envelope near her basket. "Was that your going money?" he asked. Clara threaded the new wooden thimble onto her finger. "It was." Benjamin looked toward the road. "Are you sure?" She tied off the canvas seam and handed him the finished corner. "Take this to the shed." Ethan returned near sundown with mud to his knees and no mare behind him. He had found a buyer, but had not completed the sale. Clara met him at the table. The ledger was open to the repair page. The coins rested where feed costs had been written. Ethan did not touch them. "That money was yours." Clara set the sewing basket beside Benjamin's arithmetic book. "The roof is ours." Nothing moved in Ethan's face for a long moment. Then he removed his coat, hung it beside her shawl, and began listing the lumber they could purchase by morning. They worked until the lamplight burned low. Benjamin added figures. Clara corrected them. Ethan wrote the order in his careful hand. Outside, rain tapped against the cabin roof. Inside, the 3 cups remained on the table, and Clara's empty travel envelope fed the stove. They bought the lumber at first light. Ethan loaded each board himself while Clara checked the invoice against the figures in the ledger. When Mr. Mercer leaned across the counter and asked whether she had begun keeping the rancher's accounts, Ethan answered before she could. "She keeps our accounts." He said it plainly, then carried the receipt to Clara instead of folding it into his own pocket. The word stayed with her all the way home. By noon, 2 hired men were stripping damaged shingles from the west shed. Clara kept the soundboards stacked by length, brought coffee at the proper intervals, and marked every purchase in the ledger before the numbers could be forgotten. Benjamin carried nails in an old flour tin and announced each empty handful as though it were a matter of great consequence. Ethan worked beside the men until the new sill stood level. He did not ask Clara to remain indoors. When she pointed out that the runoff needed a shallow trench along the north wall, he handed her the measuring line. By sundown, the roof was closed against weather, the hay was dry, and the bay mare stood safely in her stall. One of the hired men washed at the pump and nodded toward Clara's sewing basket on the shed step. "You taking in work here now, ma'am?" Before Clara could decide how to answer, Ethan set the hammer down. "She lives here." No explanation followed. None was needed. The man tipped his hat and returned to the wagon. Clara gathered the loose thread from her basket 1 piece at a time. Her hands were steady, but she counted the spools twice. That evening, Ethan opened the ledger to the first blank page. He wrote the ranch name at the top, then placed the pencil beside Clara's hand. Beneath the name, he had added 3 smaller words, Carter and Bennett. Clara looked toward him. Ethan was repairing the latch on the pantry door, his attention fixed on the screws. "The bank should know who keeps this place standing," he said. Benjamin leaned over the table and traced the letters with 1 finger. Clara did not answer. She tucked his Christmas note into the ledger beside the new heading, closed the cover, and placed it on the shelf with the family Bible and winter seed. Later, when she reached for her shawl, Ethan moved his coat aside so hers would hang on the stronger peg. He had already carved her name into the wood above it. Spring settled over the ranch by small degrees. The creek loosened first, then the cottonwoods showed pale green along their branches, and the south pasture began holding cattle without Ethan checking the fence twice each morning. Clara kept the ledger on the shelf beside the family Bible. Each Monday, she opened it at the kitchen table while Benjamin read figures aloud, and Ethan brought in the receipts from the pocket she had sewn into his coat. The work had become ordinary. That was what made it precious. One evening, after the last calf had been counted and the lamps were lit, Clara finished mending a shirt and set the wooden thimble inside her sewing basket. Ethan placed a cup of coffee beside her hand. Benjamin was stretched near the stove with his arithmetic book open across his knees. Clara looked toward the door. Her shawl hung beneath the name Ethan had carved into the peg, its hem touching his coat. She did not check whether her travel envelope was still gone. She had not thought of it in weeks. The next afternoon, Mrs. Harper stopped by with a jar of preserves and paused when she saw Clara's name written beneath the ranch heading in the ledger. She smiled, but Clara only asked whether the youngest girl's cough had returned. It had not. Before leaving, Mrs. Harper called the place Clara's home. The word passed through the room without anyone correcting it. That night, rain moved softly across the roof they had saved together. Ethan banked the stove. Benjamin carried the 3 empty cups to the wash basin, then returned and laid the folded quilt over Clara before she could rise from her chair. "You can finish tomorrow," he said. Clara looked down at the worn cloth, at the careful patch she had sewn near one corner and the newer one Benjamin had attempted beside it. Ethan turned the lamp lower. He did not tell her to rest. He no longer needed to. Clara leaned back while the two of them finished the last small chores around her. The cabin door was closed against the rain. The ledger was balanced. The boy was safe. Ethan's coat hung beside her shawl. For once, nothing waited for her beyond the morning. Clara closed her eyes before the lamp went out, and when sleep came, it found her exactly where she belonged.